So much change in such a short period of time. Eamon, I'd ask you that same question. It is profoundly different than it was 16 months ago. It's profoundly different than it was when Donald Trump left office.
It is, and yet still so much is still exactly the same. And I hate to be the outlier here, but I will say that the players may change and the dynamics may change, but the truth of the matter is the core issues are still the same. You have failed states across the region. You have authoritarian governments across the region. You still have Israel that wants peace with its neighbors. It has peace with some neighbors. Those peace treaties don't necessarily translate into like a warmth peace. They translate more into this kind of like cessation of hostilities. I think Egypt and Israel are the perfect example of that. So there is this sense that like things are changing, but at the same time, the root problems of the Middle East continue to be the same. And so if you're not going to have a paradigm shift in the region to address so many of these core issues, the failed states, the authoritarianism, the occupation of the Palestinians, the inability of countries to kind of progress economically and kind of bring about democratic change. As long as you don't have political plurality, if you don't have any of these kind of fundamental idealistic changes, the problems that Donald Trump are going to face are going to be the same that he faced, Biden faced, Obama faced, with just short-term solutions.
That is a good point. Is there anybody in the Middle East that wants to shift that paradigm? Anybody stepping up to try and stabilize the region? Is Saudi Arabia playing a role in that? The Qataris are obviously trying to play a pretty big role. Is there a country or a leader that can come in and try to, again, to stabilize things?
Well, you know, from an analytical point of view, people are choosing stability over progress. And I know that that may sound a little bit nuanced, but the reality is people, certainly the governments of the Gulf region that say, look, we have to end the war. We have to end the collapsed states in Libya, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Syria now, in Yemen. You have to bring these countries to a cessation of violence and then be able to build them. So I don't think any one country is coming out and saying, hey, we're reformers, we're progressives, we're going to change, we're going to become more pluralistic and more democratic. And we're not seeing that also in the so-called one democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel. We're not seeing it move to a more centrist position. What we've seen it over the years has become more hardline, more extreme right, more intrinsic in the positions that it takes towards the Palestinians. And you now have members of the Israeli government who say they oppose this deal. They want to resettle Gaza. They want to annex the West Bank. And they've got an administration that's coming into power that may be willing to allow that annexation to take place.
You know, I find your expertise in the region fascinating because you were there for the Arab Spring. You saw this moment of opportunity for the entire region, this moment of real hope that things were going to change. It didn't go that way. And now we're seeing, as you said, a hardening of positions, a hardening of conservatism or extremism or you know, hardline coalitions within these states, even Israel.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, is there a path with the hardening that would lead to stabilization? I mean, democracy has been not working so well out there, anywhere, even in Israel, it's having issues. So is a hardening of positions and just we just want to get along, let us do our thing, you can do your thing. Is that the future?
Well, the problem is I think many leaders come in with this position, certainly in democratic countries like the United States, who come in and take a position that like, hey, I just have to hold this ship for 4 years. I need to make sure that America is not at war in the Middle East for 4 years, or maybe some do want to go to war in the Middle East. But the reality is, from our position, from our democracy, as messy it is, we don't necessarily support democracy in the Middle East. We don't necessarily support democratic change in the Middle East. We prefer stability. And so the end result is that when you get countries that begin their democratic journey, it is oftentimes messy. We may get leaders that we don't like. We just saw what happened in Syria, where the leader of that country is somebody that we had a $10 million bounty on their head for a long time. So the reality is now we're going to meet with that person. Are we going to be willing to let that country develop and evolve its own democratic practices, even if at times we may not agree with it every step of the way? And I think our track record shows, and certainly those of the region, as we've seen after the Arab Spring, we prefer authoritarian governments. We prefer what is perceived to be short-term stability for long-term progress and idealism.
We've learned there are no clean decisions.
Right.
Noga, let's talk about what's happening within Israel. We were just talking with Richard a moment ago about how this has to clear some hurdles internally, including passing the Security Council and the broader parliament, the Knesset. What is the word on Ben Gvir, on Smotrich? about these are the two far right leaders within the coalition. Are they going to get on board with this?
Well, it has to pass the cabinet, but not the Knesset. At this point, it's looking like the two of them are not going to be on board with this, and probably a few others, not just the other ministers from their parties, but I bet one or two Likud ministers may not keep party discipline. I do think that Netanyahu will manage to pass this by the cabinet, but there we enter a sort of internal Israeli limbo, because listening again now to President Biden's pretty clear declaration that phase 2 implies an absolute end to this war, declared end to this war, that Israeli soldiers, he said, will withdraw from all populated areas of Gaza. I don't think at this stage that a majority of the Israeli cabinet that has been primed by Prime Minister Netanyahu to believe that Donald Trump was going to come in and let them do whatever they wanted, annex whatever they wanted, establish a Jewish theocracy in Gaza. That's what they were ready for, many of them. And that's not the reality they're crashing into right now. So I do think that Netanyahu is going to have to shore up his flanks and make more of a political effort if he doesn't want to incur Donald Trump's anger within the first month of his presidency.
What is the role that Donald Trump has played? You have Haaretz, the more liberal news outlet in Israel, the senior, I believe, diplomatic correspondent saying that Donald Trump was basically the reason this happened, that he strong-armed, that he bent Netanyahu's arm backwards and backwards and backwards until he finally came to the table to accept this deal, which, again, has been a proposal since May.
That's right. You're referring to Chaim Levinson. I don't think he's wrong, but I don't think that's the total picture here. There's an Israeli tendency to deify Donald Trump, even among the left. I think that the mistaken steps here were taken by Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu, way back in May, couldn't imagine an end to this war. He also spent this month shoring himself up politically. He brought another party into his coalition. This is going to sound pretty tinny and pretty superficial and pretty uncharitable on my part, because the war during these 8 wasted months has brought Israel very significant results, including basically eliminating Hezbollah as a real player, eliminating Hamas as a serious political player. But still, for the Israeli population, the civilian Israeli population, the idea that their children died in army service, it's a conscript army. The 6 hostages, including the American citizen Goldberg Poland, those who were executed in September, the idea that all of them could still be alive, and that this same deal was on the table in May, and that Netanyahu simply dismissed it, is not going to be easy to swallow. And paradoxically, I think the idea that that is going to shock Israelis is actually going to help Netanyahu keep his most extremist ministers on side when he tells them, look, everyone hates us right now. This government can't fall, or you're never going to have a chance at power again. You've only got me.
So you believe that Netanyahu will survive this and perhaps even thrive?
I don't think he's going to thrive. I think he will survive tomorrow's vote, and I'm happy to eat my hat if I'm wrong. But I don't actually see how his current government will survive into the phase 2 part of the agreement as President Biden described it. Of course, we have to see how Donald Trump's team, decide to implement things from the American side. But the current constellation in Israel is not going to be able to sign off on a complete withdrawal from Gaza.